think the backing singer there is a little bit off key, but that's a great song. L.A. It's from his EXO album. That's Elliott Smith there. He was a singer, musician back from the 90s or so. He had a few albums in the 90s. He was a fantastic singer and musician and acoustic guitar player. And his albums from back then, from the 90s into the early 2000s, I mean, some of the best music you'll hear from that time. He wasn't like a household name or anything. He never became, hugely famous, but he would have been very well known and respected in alternative music circles. And he was starting to get a bit of a name. In fact, he was due to play Glastonbury, I think it was 2001, and he had to pull out. And it was because he was basically, his life was in a kind of a downward spiral. He had a very troubled upbringing, came from a kind of a broken home. I think his father died young, and then there was a stepfather involved. I think he may have abused Elliott as a young fella. And the family moved around a bit. They were in Texas for a while, and they ended up in Portland, or at least Elliott Smith ended up in Portland after a while, and he lived there for, I think, 10 or 12 years or so. And, if you think about Portland today, like Portland is SJW central. I mean, it's Antifa central, it's BLM central. Like anyone who's involved in the arts up there today, you probably don't have any choice but to get involved in this identity politics stuff and to start pontificating about racism and sexism and transphobia and so on. So because Elliott Smith died so young, because he died in 2003, before that stuff had really taken root, he was able to just be a musician in his own right, just be a singer, and that his career was about his talent. His career was not about what he was going to say about Me Too, or what he was going to say about, Jeffrey Epstein, or Harvey Weinstein. I mean, or what his thoughts were on discrimination and Black Lives Matter. None of that bullshit. There's none of that nonsense tied with Elliott Smith's name. The only thing is, if you look back, there are some references to these No to Racism festivals. He did play some of those festivals. But the thing is, the important difference about those festivals back then is they were legitimately about being against discrimination. Discrimination against people based on the colour of their skin or racial or ethnic background or whatever. Like, to be anti-racist back there then was actually to be against racism. To be so-called anti-racism today is to be against white people. I mean, that's very clear. Just look at the behaviour, the attitude, the antics of these so-called anti-racists today in the NGOs in Ireland, or just the NGOs across the Western world generally. They are all about dividing people. They're all about whipping up racial hatred, dividing black people against whites. That is the way that these organisations are behaving in the modern day. And because Elliott Smith died before that stuff really became embedded in the popular culture, he never had to deal with that, thankfully. And, for someone like me who loves his music, I can listen to his music and I don't have to, think about this other stuff, this other baggage that comes with so many artists, musical artists in the modern day. Like, some of my musical heroes from back in the 90s, 80s and 90s, and some of them are still playing today, and the shite they're coming out with. I mean, I can barely look at them. I'm so disgusted. But I don't have that issue with Elliott Smith because, like I mentioned, he died before that stuff really began to take root. And I mean, in a way, it's really sad because if you are a modern day musician or comedian or entertainer of any type, or, even an author or, someone involved in the arts will say, if you don't have an opinion, and it has to be, of course, a right-on opinion about racism or sexism or something to do with LGBT or, refugees or asylum seekers, and if you don't come out with the so-called right opinion on this stuff, your career is going to be in jeopardy. Your career might go nowhere, And if you look at the people today, even the people who are talking about the Rona, people who are displaying a bit of independent thinking, the likes of Eric Clapton and Van Morrison, to an extent the Gallaghers, and there's a few others as well, I can't think of them now, Ian Brown as well, yeah. These are generally musicians who are kind of near the end of their career. They've had their hits, they've had their successful musical career. They don't need to worry about what they're saying, whether it's going to be politically correct or not. Morrissey is another example. and they've already got that legacy, and they can come out and actually state the facts. They can actually tell things as it is. And if you're a young musician or a young author or a young comedian, you don't really have that latitude. And in a way, I feel a little bit sorry for them, because there's very few of them that have that courage, that have that integrity to stand up and to say, no, I am not going to parrot this progressive, so-called progressive bullshit. I'm actually going to think for myself. I'm actually going to state the facts. I'm going to use my mind, my independent thinking, and that for me is very interesting, because Elliott Smith is an example of a brilliant musician and singer from back, 20, 25 years ago, who was allowed to be a musician and a singer, and that's what it was all about. It wasn't about this utter nonsense.